Hello everyone. Greetings and welcome to KLA Bhavasambar. The book today that will be discussed is Grief, Growth, Grace, A Sacred Pilgrimage by Dr. Neena Verma uh, and, doc- and Dr. Bhavana Nissima will moderate this session. And before I do that, and before I ask Dr. Nissima to carry forward the conversation, I would just like to briefly introduce this KLA Bhava Samvad with everyone. That the, this Bhava Samvad is the online platform of Kalinga Literature Festival, and so far there have been more than 700 sessions. And this platform honors writers and their creations in a variety of genres, including translations, fiction, non-fiction. And additionally to that, we also highlight new writers and have conversations about their most recent works. Similar to the last session, where Dr. Kalra, a gynecologist by profession, was discussing her debut novel, I Want a Boy, with the renowned novelist Anuja Chandramouli ma'am. And we have another session tonight at 8:30 p.m., during which Dr. Shikhawat will speak with Mrs. Priya Arora on her most recent work, Rama, a man of a man of dharma. And so I'll briefly introduce both the dignitaries present here who will be having the discussions. First, Dr. Neena Verma is a leadership, well-being, resilience, and grief specialist. She is the author of two internationally well-received books. Her book, Grief, Growth, Grace, A Sacred Pilgrimage, is arguably the first book by an Indian author on the complex, much needed but sorely neglected topic of grief and post-traumatic growth. Her books have been reviewed and featured in prominent media. Dr. Verma is currently working on her next book, whereby she is introducing a new and expansive construct and model of resilience, as well as serving on the International uh, Advisory Editorial Board of the AI Practitioner Journal. She is also a recipient of esteemed Professor A.B. Ghosh Prize for Excellence. She is a professionally certified coach from International Coach Federation, NTL Institute Professional Member, TAOS Institute Associate. And Dr. Bhavana Nissima is a light weaver and earth coach. She holds a PhD in communication from University of New Mexico and is the co-author of Civil Wars in the 20th Century: Lessons to Learn and Unlearn. She is a systems thinker with a cybernetics and systems view of life approach to issues on Earth. As an Earth coach, she endeavors to return osmotic connections in the linguistic and socially constructed broadlands, uh, borderlands that perceptually separate human and Earth struggles and rejuvenate with witness. As a light weaver, she writes, tells, and encourages others to tell old and new stories that tissue people with places and each other. I welcome you both, ma'am, and I would like to ask Dr. Bhavna to please carry forward the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditya. And thank you to the Kalinga Literary Festival for inviting uh, this session, which is, I think, such a profound topic and at the appropriate season, that is the advent of winter. And so glad that I get to be speaking with Dr. Neena Verma on this. Now, this is my copy of the book, and as you can see, it is just marked all over. So, in a sense, I have come, like I have read and I know. And then as I also look through it, I am not sure how much I know of what I know. So, I come here with questions from my heart of wondering what it is, as well as making an effort to make this book accessible to all the viewers here. Dr. Neena, thank you for this hour, for this time together. And I want to start with literally the beginning of your book. And I was astounded because there were two things that happened literally in the first few set of pages. And that was one, you threw open the landscape of loss and grief. And it was, I was staring at the words from, it's not just, it was loss of through death of loved ones. And then it was non death losses. It was about intangible losses. It was about socially, you know, unexplainable losses. It was stigmatized losses. It was losses through violence, traumatic losses. It was just such profound landscape of loss that you just opened out just like that. And along with that, literally holding together, you simply made this beautiful statement that death is part of life. I mean, it's just so profound that both of this exist. And yet one wonders, here it is, in each and every life that exists in this country and beyond. And yet you are the first person who writes this book, and that we need this book. So, Dr. Neena, I invite you, please tell us, like, what's happening in our landscape that we can't speak about it and deal with it and be with it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhavana. And let me begin by, first of all, greeting the audience and thanking Kalinga Literary Festival. Namaste to everyone and good evening. Um, So, as you rightly pointed out, loss is everywhere. It's all around us. And so much more non death loss than, normally, typically we think of loss in terms of bereavement only, death loss. But there's so much non death loss that punctuates our daily life. There's loss of health, there's loss of employment these days. So many people have lost their way to livelihood. There's loss of limbs sometimes in accidents or in some other mishaps. Violence, it takes away your home. Communal violence, socio communal violence. um, there's erosion in people's identity. There's attack on people's identity. And when I was writing this book, we had soon thereafter we had just entered the lockdown phases, pandemic, and so that was a surreal kind of loss that
Yeah.
no one had witnessed before or born before. We had lost the sense of normalcy. We had lost the sense of connection. And even people who were locked down within the house, suddenly they started to notice the ruptures in their relationships which on the surface looked kind of complete and whole, and suddenly there were fissures in the relationship, and vice versa also happened. The relationships which were not finding time for each other, and now they realize that what all has been lost, and they started to make bridges. So loss is all around us. But as you rightly said, there's something about our social grooming or even individual programming that we find it very hard to even name it. So much so that we think of death as the opposite of life. But as you rightly pointed out, death is part of life. Birth, marriage, education, then you have a childbirth, then in between maybe a relationship, you pass courses, you accomplish things, you get into a new job, you change jobs. All these are important and significant events on the life trajectory. And then there's a final event, and that is death. But somehow there is a very careful collective silence around it. And why? Because there's so much anxiety about even harboring the idea that one day we'll not be there, or one day our loved ones will not be there. and and with the medical technologies advent, when in the name of treatment, in some of the cases we are only postponing death.
Yeah.
So somehow we have started to convince ourselves that death is not an important topic to talk about. And since we are not willing to acknowledge the inevitability and the integrality of death, then how would we bring ourselves to even, say that, okay, let me develop some grief sensitivity. One day in life will come when I will have to sit with somebody's grief, and even more difficult, I will have to sit with my own grief.
Yes.
So that's the kind of silence, an eerie silence in our society, that we wear about the topics of loss, death, grief. And that was perhaps one of the biggest spur that I had to write this book.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Neena. The book literally takes you on that journey. And the book takes you in a journey where it's fluid, it's loose, so that the readers can find their own forms of connection, so they can enter with where they are at and land in some form in that book, in some place where it is required. um, and I found that there was these pieces, and there are places where you shake the notions, the misconceptions and myths about grief. And one important piece that we often talk about as time heals grief. And you offer even a critique of Kubler-Ross's model. Tell us a little more. Time and grief. Where are you going with that?
So, if I remember right, the exact words that I've used in the book is, where I say time heals, well, quite not. So, or well, not quite. I think this is how I put it in the book. So, yes, time is a factor. Time flows, and grief learns to flow along.
Yeah.
Time is not going to stop. Time is going to go with its own pace and with its own moods. And at some point in time, we learn to let our grief flow along. So it is not time that heals, it is we ourselves
Right.
who heal ourselves. And for that, we need time. But equally so, we need space. Equally so, we need this kind of compassionate understanding from our system, from our surroundings, that we are connecting within at this point in time. We're so lost within. When in grief, we are lost within, and we are trying to touch ourselves, we are trying to find ourselves. And for that, that process will take time. It will take a lot of patience, it will take a lot of faith, it will take will, it will take hope. And and that is why this time heals, to me it seems that this is actually applicable more on the ecosystem around than on the griever themselves. The ecosystem needs to understand that they need to allow time and space to the griever to figure out their own way and their own pace and their own manner of coming to terms with the grief and allowing it to be affirmed on the life trajectory.
Ah, thank you for that, Dr. Neena. That grief is not just of the individual. It belongs within the relationships, within the ecology that we are in, and that grief has to be held together, right? And as much as it's an inner process, but it's also holding space of the people around. And I noticed how you offered that it's not a linear process and that there is no correct way to grieve. That is, it's just a lapping and switching and moving, and each person finding their own way into how one grieves. And in that sense, it's just it's a profound, which a word, a metaphor that you use yourself is for you, that this is a pilgrimage. It's a sacred journey. It's a sacred journey, and that one finds one's own way around and through it. Well, I'm glad that you're bringing in that importance of the ecosystem, how others are holding a person who is in grief. So thank you for that. Is there anything else you want to reflect on that point?
Yeah, so since you mentioned about pilgrimage, it is a metaphor that I came up with after months and months of deliberation, of contemplating over the stories of hundreds of people that I have been privileged and grateful to have worked with in their grief journeys, and on my own lived wisdom through my own grief journey. And I realized that, what we know of pilgrimage is also a kind of limited, notion. We'll think of pilgrimage as a trip to Badrinath,
Mm.
Kedarnath, Vaishno Devi, Tirupati. And so it's a trip, and it has a finiteness that you reach there and you visit the deity, you take the prasadam, and you come back home. It's all set. But the pilgrimage that grief is,
Mhm.
it's a pilgrimage where you wonder, will you arrive?
Yeah.
There's so many moments and phases in between when you feel deep, thrown down into the gorge, dark gorge, into the abyss of your pain. And then there are moments when you feel that you are actually riding the tide and you're reaching somewhere. But at each point it feels like the pilgrimage is renewing itself. It's not that you're arriving, the pilgrimage is evolving. And with
Wow.
each round of evolution of the pilgrimage, you are evolving slowly and
Wow.
gradually. You learn on this pilgrimage that grief is not your enemy, that grief is actually your truest companion. Why? Because grief is another expression of love. It's the sad song of love. And since
Yeah.
the love does not die with the death of the deceased loved one, and therefore the grief may also not die. It's
Yeah.
just that on this pilgrimage, grief learns to soften itself. It gets the company of two more co pilgrims, which is the name of the book also, the growth and the grace part. So, growth is the post traumatic growth that begins to unfold. So, it is that kind of pilgrimage which may just carry on, carry on.
Yeah. And it's such a profound imagery that comes, right? It's not that single road kind of, but it is more an evolutionary, more a shifting, changing kind of a pathway. And
If
I
I can
noticed,
say, I can, sorry to interrupt you, if I can just add there that it is actually a pilgrimage where there's no preset path.
yeah,
There's not even a trail.
yes, yes.
You walk and you make your path.
Yes. And that is what also I noticed in your book, that your book is not exactly a how to, but then it has multiple guiding points. So if a person is coming in just needing to do an activity, there's just so many activities to do. If somebody wants to find resonance with somebody else, there's so many stories that is added. There's poems, there's quotes, there is theory, that is written, this you can do. And which appeals to the right brain, to the left brain, to the heart, to the mind, to the gut. It's just appealing at multiple levels. It's a very highly textured kind of book. So my question is, that's not an easy book to write. It's not an easy book to write for anyone. It's not an easy book to write when you are a writer and a grief therapist and someone who has lost someone very dear. How did you manage to write this book? What contributed and what were your challenges?
Um, you asked a question that is something that I have answered so many times, but every time, I find it difficult to answer. And every time I hear myself unravel one more thing about this question, which is a point of surprise also for myself. So, actually, I had set out to write a book which was meant for academic and practitioner purposes. It was not supposed to be a book for the end user, that is, the griever themselves. And one thing led to another, from one publisher to another publisher. Eventually, the challenge that came before me was to make it a hybrid thing, which will help the practitioners, but will also equally so will be usable by the end user, that is the griever themselves. So that was not my genre. I had not written conversational style before. I was used to writing academic and professional papers and manuals and all that. So that was quite challenging, and I almost kind of threw up. And that's when my mentor, grief psychology mentor, Dr. Bob Niemeyer, who's the leading authority worldwide on meaning reconstructive grief therapy, which is his creation, um, he called me and he said that, imagine what was your first motivation to write this book. I said, that is because when I was, when I was hit by my own tragedy, by my own loss, um, not that there are no grief therapists in India, there must sure be many, but maybe because I'm a recluse, a very private person, I didn't find many. And it was so hard to be my own therapist. I could help my family, I could keep them together, but I needed help also. And it is not possible to be your own grief therapist. At least it was not possible for me. And I realized that there was not much help available. I mean, I reached out to several people in several cities, but I didn't get the right help. And that was my primary motivation. So he said, okay, if that was the primary motivation, tell me, if there were a grief theorist who had reached out to you, would that have been helpful? So, he said, and then he named 4 5 books. He said, okay, you've read, I mean, I've read a wide span of books, but he named 4 5. He said, will this book be your therapist? 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 And then he named one. He said, will this book be your therapist? I said, yes. So he said, so your motivation will be fulfilled only when your book can be the therapist to the ones who cannot find one or who cannot afford one. So the challenge before me was to make it conversational. And between my editor and myself, we decided that we'll start each chapter with a real story. So each chapter, except the last one, which starts with a non-human story, which has been contributed by my younger son called Pratyush. So each chapter starts with a real story, but to respect the sentiments of the protagonists, their identities have been masked, except the ninth chapter, which has the story of my grief psychology mentor, Bob Niemeyer. He was happy to give consent for his name to be shared as his. So one was this. Then at some point, my editor felt that perhaps I need to bring in the element of my lived wisdom also. And so it was his idea that you bring in your story as well in each chapter. So you will see in almost, I think, all the chapters, maybe one or two do not have, there's a part of my story also. Now
Yeah.
these stories, the protagonist story and the part of my story, are for each chapter are the stories which synthesize the theme of that chapter,
Hmm.
which help the reader make sense of the topic, the central focus of that chapter. So these stories kind of, come and sit before them as live stories of people who have lived through these phases. And this is what perhaps worked for them. Will not necessarily work for everybody, but at least it's a point of kind of encouragement. It's a gentle nudge that yes, you too can perhaps
Yeah.
take up this journey.
I'm almost sensing a campfire right now. I'm almost sensing as if the book is a campfire around which some people share stories and commune with each other. Some people need to be at a little distance doing their own things, but staying in vicinity of the campfire. And then others who just need to cry to the sky and just let it out. And I'm sensing all those pieces all coming together in the darkness of the night, in the warmth of the fire. And I think I am getting the structure even better now. Thank you, Neena. And I think I am also realizing this particular book, that title, the center, the pivot is growth. And it is a very interesting thing where it could have been grief, but it just stands out that it's grief flanking growth. And if it is okay, for folks at who are supporting us in the back end, Mr. Sitangshu, if you would share slide 3,
3.
please. And amongst the viewers, thank you for the many questions and thoughts that is coming through. I'm partially reading because I also want to listen to Dr. Neena as fully as I can. So I'm also noticing it, and we will come to some of these questions at the end. I'm ensuring that there will be enough time. But in the meantime, as he is sharing the slide, thank you so much, Sitangshu sir. I'm going to read this piece from the book. It's page 72. And I'm actually going to start from the second para of the Growth Mandala section. My metaphor for grief and growth journey is pilgrimage. A pilgrimage is a deeply personal experience. So is the case with grief and growth. There is no single path that would serve all. The Growth Mandala offers you a guide map that you would find helpful. That said, each of us has to make our own pilgrimage our own way. There is no known path. We make our own by choosing to walk. We heed our soul's call of courage and choose to take the trail of our pain, our fears, our sorrow, our trauma, our grief. We go through the ravines of fear and the great paths of our sorrow, into the dense, scary woods of our pain, soak in the beauty of the meadows of love that nature continues to shower on us, take shelter in the serene hermitage of emerging wisdom. Trek up that mighty mountain of our suffering and find ourselves at the shrine of transformation and growth that we had little or no hope of reaching. There is no deity or priest here. We are the pilgrim, we are the priest, and we are the deity. We meet a new, healed self. We partake the holy nectar of transformation. Our pain and misery dissolve, and we reemerge with meaning. We have the choice to end our pilgrimage with healing and growth, but some of us choose to serve others and share the nectar of our transformation with the world. With love, care, and wisdom, we choose to hold space for others and live for a deeper calling and higher purpose. So beautiful, Dr. Neena. And that growth mandala. Yes, thank you so much for bringing back this piece. And viewers, if you would notice, this is not a stage-wise kind of it's not a static mandala. It is not a stage-wise this and then this, then this, but rather it is there as guide points and guide maps. I am just going to ask Dr. Neena to just briefly maybe touch on some points that you feel called to, that we may need to pay more attention.
Thank you so much for reading it out with so much emotion, so much emphasis, and so much eloquence. Thank you. That made so much more meaning. So,
It is a beautiful, beautiful section, Dr. Neena.
thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much. And in fact, there's a poetry that follows immediately
I know,
thereafter.
I wanted to, and
So,
then I'm
so,
like thinking about
so it's
time.
okay. We don't have time. Yeah, if we have time, maybe I will read it in the end. Um, one you have already shared with the viewers about the metaphor of pilgrimage. The other thing which I wanted to just share, two things, is before I get onto the model, is that the structure of the book is like this, as you have noticed that there are three sections: grief, growth, grace. So there are three parts to the book. The first part is about grief, which has just two chapters, which kind of, part of it is orienting the reader into the concepts, the theory, the models, etc., and busting some of the myths, sharing some of the metaphors of grief, the various ways that the grief manifests, the various kinds of griefs that happen, the various kinds of losses that happen. And the last part, the grace, is, what people typically call spiritual. For me, the word is existential. An
Mm.
existential level of, rooting within, an existential level of connecting with our own deep grace inside. A grace that we are all born with, but a grace that somewhere along the way, in the journey of life, we tend to lose, as we allow the business of the adult life to contaminate us. We lose touch with that grace inside. So that grace, ultimately, grief has a way of bringing you back to your own grace. So the final section is about that, in which there's a very important chapter on forgiveness in the context of grief, which is something which is so very important, but unfortunately, I haven't found many books which have touched on that topic. In between is the section called growth. Now, this is the mind of the book, which is, this growth is basically the sixth aspect, which is what you can see on the screen: grief of formation, resilient adaptation, opening to the emergent, way to the well-being and transformation, and harmonious reemergence. These are the six aspects, or you can also call them six phases, of the post-traumatic growth model that I have created, called Growth Mandala. It's come from my trainings, my applied practice, from my own lived wisdom, from what I've learned from various experts and my mentors and all that. So in this, the word mandala, why did I choose the word mandala? So mandala, we all, these days there's a lot of art classes also go around. So we all are familiar with this word. But basically, where is this word coming from? It's a Sanskrit word which has been made more popular by Buddhist practices. So mandala is a force field of not knowing as well as supreme knowing. It's a force field where both ignorance as well as enlightenment live.
Yeah.
So we can live in ignorance, or we can put ourselves in the quest for enlightenment. So this mandala thing, it has, um, in terms of the structure, you'll see Buddhist paintings which have very beautiful, elaborate, intricate paintings of mandala. If you see the circumference of this circle, is the contact point we have with what they call in Sanskrit samsara, or Buddhist call it samsara, which is the outer world, the manifest world, with which we are constantly interacting all the time. And we are also part of samsara. We are also part of the manifest world. Now, a griever has to start retreating from there without losing contact with it, has to start retreating within. And comes the outermost ring, the ring of fire. Now, this ring of fire is where you are thrown face to face with your loss, with your pain, with your fear, with your grief. And that is where the urge, the first urge of the primal brain, the primitive brain, is to run away, to take the flight, to just find an escape, because it is so very hard to
Yes.
even bear the thought of having to sit with your pain, and
Yes.
to actually have to sit with your pain. It's like ring of fire is the name which truly explains what it is. And once we go through that passage, then we come to the ring of vajra, which is where the action, the the endeavor starts. So what is the endeavor here? The endeavor, if in the first stage, the endeavor, ring of fire, the endeavor was grief affirmation. You affirm your grief. And I'm careful to use the word affirm. You don't cope with your grief. You
Mm-mm.
don't deal with your grief. You don't fix your grief. You don't manage your grief. There's nothing to fix or manage. It's not a disease. It's not a disorder. It's not an illness. Grief is a reality which you learn to live with. You learn to affirm it as part of your life, part of your being. So, grief affirmation, once that is done, then we come into the ring of lotus, sorry, ring of vajra, which is where the action here is, you learn to then resiliently adapt to your post loss reality. Loss changes everything in your personal life. So for some people,
May I just step in
uh,
for a moment, Dr. Nina? But I wanted
sorry.
to bring the attention of this word to the viewers that Dr. Nina uses the word resilience in a very different way. In a very, there's a beautiful I'm going to let you speak on it. It's not the usual sense of the resilience of the organizational resilience that we hear, but there is this. If you don't mind, if I to talk about this little story of Utkarsh talking about the yo-yo.
I would, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, I would love to. I would. I mean, I'm feeling very bad about having to stop you here, but yeah, I mean, it will be interesting if readers read this in the book.
Yes. Yeah.
But at the same time, resilience is the book that is following up. Deep resilience, which is where the whole model is coming up. So I
Ah,
was just
okay.
wondering, will it be spilling the beans too early for the readers?
Okay, okay, okay. So we will hold on. But I just want to bring to attention to the viewers that Dr. Neena brings in a it's very thoughtful and it's very insightful the way she looks into resilient adaptation. It's complex, it's emergent, it's literally the adaptation is part of an it's part of an evolution, literally. I mean, as she talks about pilgrimage as an evolutionary kind of a sacred journey, this adaptation is also what is emerging. It is by adding in more texture, but then reforming in a new way. So
Yeah,
please
it's
continue.
it's yeah, it's an expansive construct. What I'm bringing up in my next book. So
Yeah.
resilient adaptation is all about when the loss completely ruptures the fabric of life, everyday life. For say widowed people, whether or not they are working to earn, whether they are homemakers or whether they are working to earn, for widowed men as well, losing your partner of life, partner for a lifetime, it just kind of ruptures everything. uh, they can't make sense. Sometimes you have to socially regain your security, sometimes financially regain your security. Sometimes the person who's gone was perhaps the fulcrum of the family, and now the family has to rework the configurations amongst themselves. So there's so much to be adapted to. So this is the endeavor in the second circle of the mandala, which is where you actively work to rework your life. And in this you also then also create a way back to the well-being, for which you have to open up to the emergent reality. Maybe there are finances that need to be managed, maybe there's health that needs to be managed. Corona, the way it took some people away from families, there were still some more family members who were struck with corona, and there was no time to even attend to the reality that one person was lost, because say two more or three more members of the family were laid down with corona and their life was just as threatened. So opening to the emergent reality and creating a way back to well-being. Now this is not the same well-being, but it's a well-being that we nonetheless need to continue living our human life. Then eventually we come to the inner circle, which is the circle of ring of lotus. Now ring of lotus is where you find, or rather I would say create, a new you. This new you has a sense of meaning. This new you wants to allow its deeper potential to now, its deeper promises, its deeper possibilities to be now fulfilled. So this new you eventually comes to harmoniously re-emerge in the life, and then there is a certain some sense of meaning or purpose, a new call that some people take up. I know so many bereaved parents who have taken up some legacy mission in the remembrance of their children. My own family, we take forward my son's legacy mission, which he started at the age of 8 when he started running weekend payment libraries for children from disadvantaged background. All by himself, he was running weekend payment libraries at the age of 8 years and 4 months. So that's what we do. We set up community libraries. Eventually, you'll see the band here, which is self transcendent return to the world. So, why the word self transcendent? So, you're going back to samsara now. So, you're going back to the outer circumference. You're going back to samsara. But you're not you.
Yeah.
You become another version of yourself, right?
Yes.
And this another version of yourself, this transcendent version of yourself, no longer belongs to you. this transcendent version of yourself is now surrendered for the greater growth of the world. So
Yeah.
that's why self transcendent return to the world. You're returning to the world with yourself, but perhaps not for yourself alone, but as much for the world. So, this growth mandala model is the second part of the book, from chapter 4 to 9 is
Mhm.
all these six aspects and phases, as Bhavna has already mentioned. All these six aspects of phases are sovereign. They're not necessarily linear.
Yeah.
In fact, for some grievers who I work with, they don't even have much to do in the first aspect, that is grief affirmation. When they come to me, they won't work, most of the people, they won't work around resilient adaptation. But then there are some people who want to reconstruct meaning, and then they reach those phases which are not necessarily higher phases, but little farther phases, which is the phase of transformation and harmonious reemergence. You can pick up any of the chapter which speaks to you most urgently, or which you feel is where your growth is waiting for you.
Yeah. Um, Dr. Sorry, Sitangshuji, I think the slide, we can remove the slide for now. And Dr. Neena, you mentioned just now that forgiveness is a very important part of this process, and that you have researched and you have not found forgiveness as being included in grief literature. And this morning, actually, I was contemplating on forgiveness. And I was wondering, in context of grief, where is it sitting? And I kind of, for my own self, recognized an event from decades back. And I recognized the amount of anger I had about that event. That although the event I had kind of understood, but the anger was there. And so I had this moment when I just sat down after I read the chapter once more. And then I was like sitting with it and I was like, okay, this is important. I get it. And I need to say, it's okay. I understand where people were coming from. I understand. And there was this deep acceptance I felt, and acceptance for the people around, for that event, and for myself. And there was this strange calm, as if it was boiling water which had just calmed down, the temperature had come down. So I thank you for that chapter. And would you please speak on it for our viewers?
Thank you so much. So, um, it's, I won't say it's easier, but it's still kind of, it gives you some anchors, some uh, points of reference, some frame of reference to deal with when you know who you are angry with and why. But what happens in traumatic bereavement, particularly, whether it is a sudden loss, unexpected loss, untimely loss, or a violent loss, or a traumatic bereavement, the person had been terminally ill for long, or it could be an ambiguous loss, people just disappear. Think of the people who were on board the Malaysian Airlines, the fated Malaysian Airlines, which just disappeared in South China Sea. I know a professional associate whose wife was on board. Ambiguous kind of loss. You don't know when to stop waiting and when to start grieving, right? So disenfranchised loss, when the relationship is deep, intimate, but it was not public yet, or it was not socially sanctioned. So there's no room for grief. So all these kind of traumatic griefs, where there is anger, there's intense anger, there's more than anger. I would rather use the word anguish. The griever is deeply anguished, but you do not know who you need to target it, direct it towards. Who are you angry with?
Yes.
Who do you direct your anger to? And therefore, if you do not know how to direct your anger, where to direct your anger, then who do you forgive? And how do you
Yes.
forgive? And then, traumatic bereavement, violent bereavement. I've often heard the bereaved family, um, the near and dear ones. Think of God in a very angry way.
Yeah.
It's an unfair, unkind, and not acceptable loss. This loss just breaks your assumptive world of beliefs on which you had been operating so far, that the bad things do not happen to good people, parents don't outlive children, you know, and although all the assumptive beliefs on which you had built up your world, they have come crashing. Here are parents. I worked with um, parents who lost each one of their four children to the same genetic blood disorder. Do you think you can even think, can, you know, begin to imagine the thought of having to sit with such parents? Forget about, having to hold them. I never felt so desperate and helpless. And even as I'm thinking of that, I'm overcome with pain, their pain, my pain. So in such cases, the anguish is deep. So why is then forgiveness important or possible? How is it possible if you do not know where to direct it?
Yeah.
It is important because that very anguish is taking up, that very bitterness is taking up all of that space where your love for your deceased loved one is supposed to live.
Ah,
So, your heart, which is supposed to be the home of love for your deceased loved one, gets filled with all the anguish and the bitterness.
yes.
And we
Such
cannot
a
control
profound.
it, we cannot drive it out, we cannot push it out. It's not something that we can surgically, get rid of. It is something that we'll need to process and heal. And the balm for that is forgiveness.
Beautiful. Thank you,
And that
Dr.
forgiveness
Neena.
may remain unsaid, it may
Yeah.
remain unexpressed, it may remain something very, very deeply personal and private. It's something that happens within you. You don't even have to make a declaration about it. And sometimes you cannot forgive. That too is fine. Certain
Yes.
things, you are human, and being human, it's not possible all the time for me to forgive every single wound and pain. That too is fine. Just remember, where is your energy in that case going?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Neena. We have a lot of questions coming up, and we would probably need to close this conversation so that you can take up the questions. But I do want to do a small reading. Is a just as this next part of moving from that growth into grace space. And this is from a section called,
Can I, sorry to interrupt you. A question just came before my eyes. So it says, what role do self-compassion and forgiveness play in healing after loss? I think I have already talked about forgiveness. And let me tell you, self-compassion, or in fact, compassion, sometimes compassion even for the wrongdoer, um, they go hand in hand.
yeah.
They're
Would you
deeply
prefer if,
entwined.
yeah, would you prefer if we just took up the questions, Dr. Neena?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
okay.
were going to read, please, if you want to.
I think the questions might just be resonating more at this point. Um, I, okay, so let's just go back over here. Okay, so can storytelling help overcome grief?
Can storytelling?
Help overcome grief.
So, first, my humble submission, maybe this construct works for you. Um, I would just say, from my personal understanding, personal experience of having worked with hundreds of people, and also my own lived wisdom, overcome is a word that somehow does not sit well with grief. There's nothing to be overcome. We learn to live with it. And in that storytelling, yes. what happens is that there's also hush hush about grief. So people will come, they would want to know what happened. But they would want to know this more out of social courtesy, not really to sit with you in the unfolding of your story. At the same time, to be able to tell your event story, and to be able to touch back and reconnect with your backstory, your relationship story, and your future story. All these are very, very important things. They are very therapeutic things. They heal very much. But then you have to find a person or a space or a space which will sit with you with a sense of curious compassion, not asking your story only out of social courtesy. They're more social mourners, who are visitors, who will come, who will just do their job of having met us once in the wake of our loss. Very few people you'll find who will genuinely have the, I would say, more than intention, the pain bearing capacity, because when you have to sit with somebody's story, you have to have that enormous amount of strength within yourself to be able to witness the unfolding of their story. But storytelling, yes, it has hugely therapeutic effect. If you don't find anybody, please tell your story to your journal.
Right. One of our viewers has asked, how can readers apply the principles of growth and grace to their everyday lives, even in midst of challenging circumstances? And I just want to add that Grief, Growth and Grace, tomorrow is the third anniversary of its launch. It was launched on November 24th of 24th of 2021. So it has reached many bookstores, it has reached many hands, and it's enjoys a third birthday tomorrow. So this question, how can readers apply the principles of this book in midst of their life?
So before the little longer answer, can I give the short answer from the cover of the book?
Yes,
The
please.
flap on the inner cover on the front side. The last para says, "This book is for you. If you believe that an affirmative, resilient, and meaning-centric approach to life radiates light in the dark night of pain." Now, here I have left it unsaid whether this pain is pain of grief or it is pain of any other adversity or any other life storm that you have encountered and that now you need to navigate and learn to live with or go past and grow from there. Then it also says, and this book is for you if you're keen to facilitate deep existential growth for yourself and others, whether or not in grief. So this is a quick answer from the cover, but how do you apply these principles? So if you go particularly to say chapter 7, way to well-being, so the various things that I have shared, the concepts and the exercises and the activities in this chapter about how you kind of regenerate the sense of well-being within yourself is something that you can apply in everyday context. In my next book, I'm talking of something called everyday resilience, which is what we need, because every day is full of hassles and hiccups that happen to us every day, but we just don't allow us an opportunity to sit and process them and create ways to navigate our way through them. So way to well-being will give you quite a few inputs. Then transformation chapter, the chapter 8, will also be helpful because some of the non-death losses, some of the life storms that we encounter, which are other than death losses, also shake up the whole thing around in our ecosystem. They sometimes leave us shattered inside. And to emerge from that means that we have to allow our transformation to happen, to allow our pain to transform us, and to allow our pain to unravel the possibilities, the new invitations of growth. So you can look up that chapter, resilient adaptation. As I told you, my editor loved it so much that he asked me to develop a whole book out of it. But that book is now much more than that. So Resilient adaptation is also very relevant on an everyday basis. Baki, it is a big book. I cannot tell you everything in this brief session. I would encourage you to pick up the book and specifically look for these chapters if you are looking for everyday help. And the last chapter also, which talks about gratitude, compassion, and meaning in life.
The next question is, in what ways is a grieving mind different from a mind that is not grieving? Do you think grief brings a different kind of sensibility?
Absolutely, grief brings a different kind of sensibility. The second sentence I will respond to first. In the wake of grief, there's so many people who develop a heightened sense of appreciation for life, reverence for life. Suddenly, you begin to notice the tiny, tiny things in life which you were earlier either not noticing or taking them for granted. People start to invest more deeply in relationships. People also ask themselves, so what really is the deeper essence and the higher purpose that I'm supposed to um, fulfill in this life. So they ask themselves more existential questions, and which obviously then also open up ways for more existential, deeper existential growth. Now, the first question is grieving mind different? Yes. There's a word which pandemic has made popular, which is brain fog. Now, grieving mind's brain fog is very peculiar. Sometimes what happens, you might have heard some people or you might have read somewhere, sometimes bereaved people walking on roads or in a busy marketplace or somewhere, they would experience something called face in the crowd syndrome. They would be 100% certain that they have just seen their deceased loved one, and the deceased loved one has now disappeared into the crowd. Now, what is happening? Have they gone crazy? No, they're not gone crazy. They're just grieving. And what happens is that our brain, our mind, uh, which has various neural circuitries, it has neural circuitries about each of our relationships also. Now, what happens that the person who we are mourning, who we are grieving, is gone, but the neural circuitry in my brain, which pertains to this person, my deceased loved one, is still alive and active. That neural circuitry is searching for stimulus and is not finding the stimulus because that person is not available. And now that neural circuitry will get desperate to either feed itself or refigure itself. So we tend to forget things, we tend to over repeat the same thing one time, two times. Sometimes we begin to obsess over small things. Sometimes there's a complete, there are people who leave for work and then standing at the bus stop, they're asking themselves, where am I going? There's a lose complete sense of where they had stepped out of home to go to, and which bus should they take, which direction should they be driving. Sometimes people forget the way to their own houses. Why? Because grieving brain is badly agonized. It's not necessarily angry brain, but grieving brain is agonized. It's very unsettled. Its neural circuitry is totally disheveled. So it needs time. You need to, one thing I want to mention here very carefully for everybody's benefit. We think of broken heart syndrome, which neuroscience research has established is for real. It is not something which is a myth, but it has been established. Broken heart syndrome is real. You have just now asked me about grieving brain also, but one part which we do not notice is body. In grief, the body is hit the worst. The amount of cortisol and the non-stop, unrelenting generation of cortisol hormones, the stress hormones in the body is so high that the toxic energy level is so high that almost all of our water reserves, they dry up. The body dehydrates completely. Obviously, you lose appetite, you lose sleep, you don't feel like eating, you don't feel like walking, but the body needs to survive. So my request to you is please take care of body. If you cannot eat one full meal, two full meals, please take small meals every 3 to 4 hours, maybe a little khichdi or a fruit or little milk or a soup or something. Keep sipping water, preferably lukewarm water. Aerated drinks, just say no to that for some time. Your body is totally dehydrated. You need to hydrate it the natural way. So take as much water as you can. Maybe take a little nibu pani or dal ka
I
pani
am
or
sorry
nariyal.
to interrupt
Yeah.
because we have run over the hour, and I know there are so many other questions, folks. We have noticed those questions. So, one way is you can contact Dr. Neena directly. We'll just put that up on the screen. Just give me a moment. Um, this Yes, thank you so much, Sitangshuji. So you can contact her with the questions, and I'm sorry, there were a lot of lovely important questions that Dr. Neena, if she had brought her attention, could have led to something more profound. And there's also the readings I really wanted to do. But then here is the thing, you can get yourself this book. This is a book that can help you at any point, can be by with you at any point. And it's also a great book to gift people. Um it's a beautiful book. It has got so much inside it, and you can land anywhere you want. I thank the
Uh,
Kalinga Literary
can I
Festival organizers.
Can I just
Yes.
mention people who prefer reading in small bites? Maybe you can subscribe to my Grief Wisdom newsletter on Substack. Look up Grief Wise with Neena Verma. You can just type it in Google and it will lead you to my Substack. So
Okay.
I try to write once every month, but now this time it has been long, long gap.
I thank the Kalinga Literary Festival organizers for having these online sessions. 700 sessions so far is just magical. It's so beautiful. It's a treasure chest of a YouTube channel and a Facebook page. I hope people will subscribe to this channel, and you can look for other authors and other topics that may resonate for you. I'm going to give it back to the organizers to add whatever they need to at this point. In the meantime, thank you all for being present here and for engaging as deeply as you have, as our comment sections show us. And thank you, Dr. Neena, for sharing all that learning and all that learning, both through life, through your body, as well as through all the research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I I would just say I do not have apt and adequate words to um, thank Kalinga Literary Festival, Mr. Bal, Mr. Parida, Debumitra, and Sitanshu and Aditya, and everyone who at the back end is making it happen. And this is a very important and inspiring endeavor, and I would be very happy to contribute my humble bit going forward in any way that I can. And I thank all the live audience for such an engaged participation. And most of all, I thank you, Dr. Bhavna, for making it so flowing, so alive. Thank you.
Thank you.